If you choose to use the Mental Ray renderer, then you'll want to adjust its parameters, of course, its render setup options, and you might need to do things like change the lighting and materials as well. And in fact, that's what I've done in this version of the scene. I've replaced all the physical materials on my cactus and the other objects with standard materials, and Mental Ray will be able to handle those standard materials, whereas the physical material would actually cause Mental Ray to throw up an error message on the screen because those materials are not really supported. Likewise, to get better results with Mental Ray, I've chosen to use photometric lighting rather than the standard light. And so this spotlight here now is actually a photometric spotlight. And also, I've re-enabled gamma correction because, again, you do want gamma enabled when working with photometric lights. We'll just check in on that. Go to Customize Preferences just to show you that gamma is currently enabled. All right, now let's choose our physical camera. We'll right-click in that view and then go up to the render setup. And just to make sure that we always render that physical camera, we can lock the render here. So it says View to Render Quad 4 Phys Camera. Let's lock that. And then choose the different renderer from this pull-down list. Let's choose NVIDIA Mental Ray. And we'll do a test render with just default Mental Ray options. And click on Render. And what we see is a two-pass rendering in which we get that kind of mosaic effect, and that's called Final Gather. And it's calculating the bounce light off of diffuse surfaces. You can see that down here, the teapot is brighter at the bottom, and that's because light is bouncing off of this pedestal here, which is pure white, and that diffuse illumination is hitting the other objects. You can see that it looks kind of jagged or aliased, and especially with the shadows, they look kind of crunchy. We're also getting some aliasing here in other areas, and we can zoom in. This is actually a 1280 by 720 image. I can use the wheel and zoom in a bit here, and we can see that it's kind of crunchy. These little filaments on these flowers are not really rendering at a good anti-aliased quality. First, let's deal with these shadows here. The reason why that's happening is not because of the settings for Mental Ray proper, but because of the settings in the light. Mental Ray doesn't really render scanline shadow maps in the same way. It's not able to really soften them up. You can use Mental Ray shadow maps if you want, but really for best results, we want to use ray trace shadows with a light radius. Let's look at that. With that light selected, I'll go into the Modify panel. And then we want to go into the area at the top here, General Parameters, change the shadow type to Ray Trace Shadows. And what we'll get here are vector-based shadows that are super crisp with no softness. To give it some softness, we can scroll down and in the Shape/Area Shadows section, change it to some other value other than point. Let's try a disk. And now we can see we got a circle there on the light, and it is 5.5 inches in radius. So that'll fix up the issue with our shadow maps looking crunchy. And now let's go back into the Render Setup dialog, and we can change the overall quality of the rendering. Go into the Renderer tab, and for Mental Ray, you can control the quality here in this Samples per Pixel section. Really, all you need to worry about is this quality field. And right now it's at a value of 0.25, which is a draft quality. A good value for production rendering might range between 1 to 2, or a value of 3 at the utmost greatest value if you're having issues with aliasing. But here I think a value of 1 will probably be fine. All right, cool. So we fixed up our shadow, and we've also increased the overall quality of the rendering. Let's do another test render. It might take a little bit longer. And our shadows might be a little bit grainy, but we could control that by adjusting the size of the light. You can see that because we have a higher quality setting, it is going to take a little bit longer to render. All right, so that's finished. I can tell definitely that I want a lower radius to that light. I'll go back in here and set this down to a value of 1 inch. And then finally, we can control the quality of the bounce light, which is called Final Gather. And that's going to be found in the Global Illumination tab here. Final Gather is enabled by default. If we scroll down a bit, you'll see Final Gathering, and it's at draft quality right now, which is actually giving me good results. But if I wanted to increase that quality, I could just drag this slider, or I could play around with these values here. Really, the main thing that I want to do here is just check in on the number of diffuse bounces, and it's set to a value of 0 here. That's kind of misleading. It's actually doing 1 diffuse bounce already. In other words, light is bouncing off of this pedestal and hitting the teapot down here, and we're getting 1 diffuse bounce always. This is actually additional diffuse bounces beyond the first one. And really the optimal value for that is 1. The total number of diffuse bounces is now 2. And that's going to help us to lighten up some of these shadows here. All right, cool. So I think we've got pretty good settings here for Mental Ray. And we can go ahead and click on Save File because I'm pretty confident that this is going to give us a good result. I'll need to give it a new name because I don't want to overwrite the existing file. I'll click on this button here to browse, and I'll call this one Mental Ray Test. And click Render. It'll go through and render, and it'll also save the file onto disk. All right, that's concluded. Let's maximize this view and zoom in with the wheel. We can examine this and use the middle mouse button to navigate. And now you can see with an additional diffuse bounce, we're getting some light bouncing off the teapot and actually hitting the pedestal here. And we're getting pretty clean shadows, and we're not seeing any real aliasing issues on the model proper. All right, that's a real basic introduction to the Mental Ray settings. If you want to go deeper into the Mental Ray settings and learn more how to light a scene such as this one, we cover that in other courses. And specifically, I've got a course called Rendering Product Shots in 3ds Max that goes pretty deeply into the Mental Ray settings.